All right. Good evening, everybody. I hope you're doing great. And it's just a smidge after 5 o'clock. And so we'll give everybody else that might be used to my normal start time of 5:02 or 3 a moment to jump on. I see, I started to say Randy and Sodney. I know that's not right. Sandy and Rodney King are here, and I'm glad you're here. So looks like there might be a few others that are on here as well. Say something and let me know. Hi, Margaret. How are you? Good to have you on here as well. Um, I hope that I have my technical difficulties solved. I'm not going to promise that. I believe that I've made some changes that will fix that. I am not using the wireless at all, and so we are hardwired, and I'm not using wireless. So hopefully that's going to help and keep me a little bit more focused and me also less distracting for you guys. Dorothy Fox, good to have you here. And I don't know if you all know this or not, but Dorothy and I have got some connections through Antioch in times past. Different folks that we know. Hello, sweetheart. Miss Katie Goldman Vaughn is on here, and Shirley Hicks is on here, and Janet Knox and John are on here. And just glad you're here. Just glad you're here. Guthrie, Mr. Guthrie is here, and I didn't see your bride this morning, but anyway, I hope everybody's doing great. We're going to be picking up where we left off in First Kings, and I see Myrtle Schaefer is on here. Schaefer's are on here. Hutchins are on here. We're going to be picking up where we left off in Kings, but I'll go back and give a quick review. And I just want to make sure that there's so many biblical stories, and they're so good in the Old Testament, but sometimes they're just like gnats floating around out here, and we don't have any context to put them in, and we don't know the overarching history of what God's doing. We know creation and the flood and Abraham and Moses, and then after that it gets kind of murky. And if you've been reading along with the Kings and Chronicles readings, I think we're in Chronicles now, it's so many names, and they bounce back and forth, and it's just a little bit hard to follow. And so I'm trying to clear that up a little bit, and hopefully that will assist you to follow that. Brett says hi from the teen room. Everyone says hi. Hi, guys. I can almost assure you they're not going to be watching this long term. They will not be watching my riveting thoughts about First and Second Kings and the history of ancient Israel. But it's great to see you guys saying hi there. Taylor's hello. How are you? And so anyway. Let's see, 5:05. Let's go ahead, and I'll start with a prayer, and we'll have some folks maybe join us here as we go along. It looks like I've got 18 on here, 18 households. So we'll see if some more join us, and but I'm glad you're here. So let's pray. Our Father in heaven, thank you for today. Thank you for your blessings. Thank you for a great morning of worship together, coming together with the saints here at Kingwood. We're thankful for Kylie Jolly's baptism. We're thankful for her decision to follow you and give her life to you. Father, we're thankful for this church family, our elders, as they shepherd us, the ministries, the deacons that lead those, and the ministry leaders, and we're thankful for the work that's done. As Jeff has reminded us as we go through our vision and values this month, the importance of caring for each other. And I just pray that you will put that on our heart to do something for others every day, and that question will come to mind: what can we do for others today? And Father, again, I just thank you for that. Thank you for the time tonight to get into your word. I pray that it makes sense, that it is not boring, that it is helpful in understanding the way you work through history. And Father, again, we thank you for your son Jesus, and it is through him we pray. Amen. Okay, so the task is a tall one, but we're up for it. And let's get going, and I'll see if I can bring us back to where. Do you remember the way that we started Amos? And uh-oh, no slide. Okay, should have some sound now, hopefully. All right, let me back up, Rodney. Thank you for catching that. So I was just pointing out that this article is in the Smithsonian. You could look this up on your own. I just saw it this week. It's about the earthquake that happened during the days of Amos. And I don't know if you recall the way Amos begins, but it says 2 years after or 2 years before the earthquake. I don't remember which way it is actually worded, to be honest with you. But Amos alludes to this earthquake. And so they have discovered, as they're digging down through the rubble in these excavations and archaeological digs, this in multiple places, in the Dead Sea floor, in Jerusalem now, is where this picture is taken from. This article is discussing, and a couple of other places, at the same level of the archaeological dig that would have been associated with the 8th century or the 700s, which is when Amos appeared on the scene and was prophesying in the northern kingdom. So anyway, I love this because here's just a very timely piece of information and verification that yes, there was an earthquake, and it kind of helps us with dating Amos as well. So if you're interested in that, there's a little video that accompanies this article that might be worth looking at when you go to look at that article, if you do. So anyway, let me see if I can click the slide here and that the sound will still be working. I think it is. Okay, so let's go back to what we were talking about. I think I went one too far, didn't I? I'm going to move this so I can see that my sound is on. Okay, so again, the history of what we're talking about is after Moses led the 12 tribes into Canaan, and they were ruled by these roaming judges, not really territorial, but they, kind of ruled different places and helped make decisions. And then we proceeded to go to Saul. The people wanted a king, so they could be like everybody else. Saul, as you know, gave way to King David because Saul was not a good leader. And then David's son Solomon was on the king, and we focused on him last week. And Solomon was led astray by his wives, even though he was very wise and very wealthy, and was a very accomplished builder. He built the temple, he built his palace, and so forth. He ultimately, the downfall was the fact that he had so many wives and concubines. They all worshipped foreign gods, and so ultimately that led to the downfall of Solomon and the end of his kingdom and of his leadership and monarchy. And then that led to Jeroboam, becoming the king in the north, and Solomon's son Rehoboam becoming king in the south. So it basically led to a split in the kingdom. The north got 10 tribes, and the south got 2. And so we kind of ended the week last week with this setup. Okay, so what happens after the kingdom? The kingdom of God in Canaan, right, splits into a north and south. The north being Israel, south being Judah. Well, let's focus on the north tonight, and let me pick up here with Jeroboam, the king of the north. So here's what happens. Then Jeroboam fortified Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim, and he lived there. So he makes his residence there. He goes out and he built up Peniel. And Jeroboam thought to himself, that's usually a sign there's going to be a problem when it says thinks to himself instead of inquiring of God. The kingdom is now likely going to revert to the house of David. In other words, it's going to go back to David's grandson, to Solomon's line, to David, okay, to Rehoboam. So he's thinking, I'm worried about losing the kingdom. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, which is in the south, they will again give their allegiance to their lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. Now remember, they'd left Rehoboam because he had not listened to his father's advisors and said, I'm going to be tougher than my dad. And, they'd all left and gone with Jeroboam. So he's worried about this now. After seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. Okay, that's not good. And we're going to see how that plays out. He said to the people, it's too much for you to go to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. So here we go. Aaron made a golden calf back in the days of Moses, right, when they were coming out of Egypt. And now here, Jeroboam gets the idea. I'm going to make 2. And this is who brought you out of Israel. One he set up in Bethel, the other in Dan. Now you may recall some of this in the Amos, the book of Amos that we talked about, how there was Bethel and Dan and the golden calf worship and idolatry. We're going to see the significance of this in a minute. This thing became a sin. The people came to worship the one at Bethel and went as far as Dan to worship the other. So they're going back and forth to these places in northern Israel worshiping these cows. Jeroboam built shrines on high places, appointed priests from all sorts of people, even though they were not Levites. So he's done multiple things here. He instituted a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the festival held in Judah. He offered sacrifices on the altar. This he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves he had made at Bethel. He also installed priests at the high places he had made. On the 15th day of the 8th month, the month of his own choosing, that's emphasized there, he offered sacrifices on the altar he had built at Bethel. So he instituted the festival for the Israelites, and he went up to the altar to make offerings. Okay, so here we have King Jeroboam worried about losing the people, so he takes matters in his own hands. He moves the center of worship from Jerusalem, which was not supposed to be done. He created a festival of his own choosing. He made golden calves and said, these are your gods. He made priests out of people who were not Levites. I mean, he went to the trouble of creating a whole new religion, essentially, to keep the people up north. I'm going to keep these people to myself, even though God had put Jeroboam in this place. And he should not have worried about that. God had taken the kingdom from Solomon and given it to Jeroboam. And so Jeroboam does this. Now I want you to see a couple of things. We're gonna. This is all contained pretty much in 1 Kings, the book of 1 Kings. Again, Kings was one large scroll, one large book split into 2 scrolls because it was so long. So when he says 1 Kings, 2 Kings, it usually means first scroll, second scroll. Same book, same story. So anyway, let's look and see kind of what is going on here. So just to review, I've got some charts here, and you may or may not like charts, but look here. This is the United Kingdom, not Britain, but the United Kingdom there in Canaan, God's kingdom. And you have Saul as the king, that second column. Then you have David, and then you have Solomon. Look at those years there on the left, right? from about 1000 BC to about 930 BC. That was the Saul, David, Solomon era. And then you've got, the various prophets that are associated. Samuel, we know Nathan, and David had some interactions, and we know Samuel anointed Saul and anointed David, and then you have Nathan interacting with Saul still. Solomon. So anyway, there's kind of a quick history. So let's go to this next one. Let's look at the very bottom after Solomon, how the kingdom splits into two. And this divided kingdom, on the right side is Israel, on the left side is Judah. And you see the two kings there, Jeroboam I, who had been a servant of Solomon, and then under Judah you have Rehoboam, who had been a son of Solomon. Okay? And you see the prophets that are associated there. We haven't gotten into those guys, and we probably won't have time to, but you're coming into the 900s here. All right, hang with me. And so I want you to see what happens after Jeroboam creates this new, remember the word syncretism, the mixing of the old and the new, right? He creates this new syncretism in the north, where it's this corrupted version of Israel's worship. And so let's see what happens. I want you to follow these scriptures here. And I'm going to reference a bunch of them. They're all going to say the same, pretty much the same thing. These are all kings, and I want you to see how they describe them and what they do. These are all kings of Israel. Nadab, son of Jeroboam, became king of Israel in the second year of Asa, king of Judah, and he reigned over Israel 2 years. Okay, again, not important to remember anything except this next part. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the ways of his father, committing the same sin his father had caused Israel to commit. So he commits the same sins of Jeroboam. Okay, what about Asa's follower? Okay, Baasha becomes king over all Israel. He reigns 24 years. What does Baasha do? He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the ways of who? Jeroboam, and committing the same sin Jeroboam had caused Israel to commit. Again, what were those sins? Well, the golden calves, the removal of Jerusalem from the worship center, etc. Okay, let's look at another one. Zimri becomes king, and interestingly enough, he sets the whole palace on fire around him, and he dies. That's a whole other story, but look what he did. Because of the sins he had committed, doing evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the ways of who? Jeroboam. Now, these are not all kinfolk of Jeroboam, but they're all following the ways. In other words, they didn't do anything about the problem, right? They kept committing the same sin Jeroboam had caused Israel to commit. The two golden calves, the festivals, etc., the high places worship. And then Omri comes along, and he does evil and sins more than all those before him. That's an ominous description. He follows completely the ways of Jeroboam, commits the same sin, arouse the anger of the Lord by their worthless idols. Okay, are you getting a trend here? It goes on. Now we're in 2 Kings. Joram, son of Ahab. What does he do? Well, guess what? I bet you can guess. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, but not as his father and mother had done. He actually got rid of the sacred stone of Baal that his father had made. Oh, he surprised us. Whoops, no he didn't. Nevertheless, he clung to the sins of Jeroboam. Man, you hate to have a sin named after you, and you hate to be the one who starts it all, because Jeroboam has set a trend here, hadn't he? It's committing the sins of Jeroboam, committing the sins of Jeroboam. And these idols in Bethel and in Dan. And again, this corruption of the Israel, of what God wanted them, how they wanted them to worship. Again, this is significant because of the prophets, okay, and the messages that they continue to bring. Okay, let's look at Amaziah. I promise this is going to go a few more minutes, but not too much longer. In the 15th year of Amaziah, Jehoash, right? I'm sorry, Jeroboam. This is Jeroboam II becomes king in Samaria. And this is going to be the king who's on the throne when Amos comes, by the way, Jeroboam II. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, didn't turn away. What did he do? He did the same sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. All right. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, didn't turn away from Nebat, the sons of Nebat sins there. Azariah, he reigned in Samaria 10 years. Guess what he did? Entire reign, he didn't turn away from the sins of Jeroboam. We're getting to the end. Pekahiah did evil. He didn't turn away from the sins of Jeroboam. Azariah, Pekah now becomes king, and he reigns 20 years. He did evil. He did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam. All right. Now, what's interesting is that Pekah, I believe, is almost the last king. Hoshea is the last king. And I don't know if you remember this. I'm going to show you that chart here in just a minute, a little more detail. But what I'm trying to get you to see is this generation after generation have been led astray because they've not fought back against what their forefathers have done. When they made a mistake, they kept propagating it down the stream. The sins of Jeroboam, the sins of Jeroboam, the sins of Jeroboam. You know, it's probably worth a discussion of generational sins and the way things can get embedded. Maybe we'll have time for that at the end, a little bit of discussion. But let's look here at what God finally decides to do. And we read this as a preamble to Amos. When he tore Israel away from the house of David, right? So Solomon's reign was, Israel left Solomon's son Rehoboam. They made Jeroboam the king. And Jeroboam enticed Israel away from following the Lord, caused them to commit a great sin. We've already been discussing this ad nauseum. Then the Israelites persisted in the sins and didn't turn away from them, so they kept doing it. When? Until the Lord removed them from his presence, as he had warned through all his servants, who? The prophets. So we're starting to get a reminder again, what's the role of a prophet? Speak for God, especially in times of disobedience and waywardness. And so the people of Israel were taken from their homeland into exile in Assyria. And at the time of this writing, they're still there. Okay? So let's look here at this chart. You can kind of ignore the left side. I want us to focus on the green. But I do want you to see that the list of kings there, and then down here at the bottom, the red bar indicates that they were taken into exile by Assyria in 722 BC. So after a couple hundred years after Solomon, after the split, they were taken into exile. And you can look at this side and see that Judah manages to stay out of exile a little bit longer, maybe another 150 years or so, 140 years. They have more kings and they move on down. That red line is much lower. Again, I don't want this to bore you. I want you to see the trend here. I want you to see, I'm not so much interested in you understanding details, but I do want you to look in the column. If you go to the very right side of this chart, and you come back one column, it says prophet. And I want you to look at the names in the side of Israel there that were prophets. You have Ahijah, Jehu, Micah, then you have Elijah. You've heard of Elijah. You have Elisha. You've heard of Elisha. We're going to talk about them briefly at the end. And then you come down into Zechariah, the king, and then who are the prophets there? Amos, Hosea. Now, Jonah again went to talk to the Ninevites in Assyria. By the way, who was it that came in and exiled the Israelites? Well, it was the Assyrians, and God was working on them too, because they were very evil people. And he sent Jonah, and Jonah did not want to go over there because he knew the world power that they were becoming. And so anyway, you can kind of see the way that's flowing. Again, ignore the left side, the yellow for now, but just look at the right. And we'll talk about Micah here in a couple of weeks, and then we'll kind of be done with the side there of Israel. So you've got this split into two kingdoms, and all these prophets are coming into Israel, these northern tribes, because of their there's a better look at it, because of their idolatry. And you look under the names of these kings, and it says evil. They started evil, they ended evil. Evil, evil, evil. On down through there, you have Jehu, who actually started good and ended evil. But there's predominantly, these were not good people, and they continued to propagate idolatry. And so this is important. And again, I want you to notice these prophets that are speaking to them. And again, we'll talk about Elisha and Elijah here at the end. Again, they did not, to our knowledge, write anything, but they were active players. So there were all kinds of prophets speaking to people, saying, turn, repent, change, go back to God. I don't know if you remember some of the things that they were doing, but they were preaching. And so, again, these prophets, as we talk about these minor prophets, minor only meaning the size of their writings, not their importance. These 12 minor prophets, many of them were speaking into the northern tribes of Israel at the very end, giving them these last chances, right? And actually throughout, but the ones that wrote were at the end. So it's important to know, again, that these messages, these prophetic messages, are not floating around out there in the Bible. Well, God wrote this to me. I better turn and change. Yes, He did. He wants us to give our hearts wholly to Him, to learn from the example of the Israelites and the way they particularly fell away from Him and were led astray, and it just kind of one after the other, built on this sinfulness and idolatry. But originally, these messages were for those people, and I want you to understand that. So when you're reading, you're thinking, why is he talking about Dan and Bethel and calves and all this stuff? It's just that's what's going on. These prophets are speaking powerfully, boldly into the lives of these peoples who were just happy as they could be to worship cows, golden calves in this case, up in the northern kingdom. And I don't know if you remember Amos, but they were also very the way they treated each other, the social justice, the way they treated people. They lacked integrity, and they lacked decency in worship, and they were prosperous and selfish. And okay, I want you to get this view of what's going on. It's so important when we read the prophets to understand who they were speaking to. And so hopefully this helps and isn't just boring you out of your mind. All right, so let's go back and look. Again, I told you I wanted to look at Elijah and Elisha. So again, before we dig into that, I want us to see that, again, at the end of the kings there, you have Amos, Hosea, Jonah, Micah. We know them from their writings. But you and I also know the ministry, the prophet ministries of Elijah and Elisha. And you see Elijah up here. Let's look at him for a second in these chapters in 1 Kings. You see Ahab mentioned there as a king. We know Elijah and Ahab's wife. Do you remember her name? Jezebel. We don't use that name when we're naming our kids anymore. You might use it as a derogatory term. She was an evil, idolatrous woman who led Ahab around a lot with his thinking and worship. But there's Elijah and Ahab. We're going to talk about those interactions. And then you have Elisha as well. Maybe not quite as well known, but a lot of stories written about him. So let's look at those, okay? Let's look a little bit at Elijah and Elisha and their ministries, just some highlights, because they're actually worth going back and looking at on your own. Here as examples of the way prophets were. Some were speaking and preaching, and others were doing miracles. And again, just a little side note here. In the New Testament, there were also prophets. Agabus was one in the book of Acts, but many people thought Jesus was a prophet, right? And they also thought who? John the Baptist was a prophet. So again, it's important to understand the prophetic personality. And again, we know, Hosea married Gomer and lived in this unfaithful relationship with her, bringing her back as an example. We know Amos was just a simple guy, a regular guy, who was a shepherd and a fig farmer, and he went to the northern kingdom and preached. We know Jonah was called to go to Nineveh. Anyway, you get the idea. These are all just swirling around. These were kind of folk preachers. And so let's look here at some quick stories about Elijah. Again, from 1 Kings 17 through 19, you're going to find these stories. There was a drought that he prophesied about. And during that drought, he was fed by ravens. He encounters this widow who has nothing, and he asks her for some food because he's getting hungry. And she says, I have nothing, but she makes him something out of what little she has, and then he causes the jar of flour and a jug of oil that she had to never run out. And then later, her son dies, and Elijah resurrects him from the dead. So again, you can think back to Jesus, why they think as Jesus performs miracles, he must be Elijah or one of the prophets, because he's resurrecting, right, people from the dead. That's the kind of amazing miracles that the prophets would do. Then this well-known battle of prophets, the prophets of Baal and the prophet Elijah on Mount Carmel, with the altars and the sacrifices, and God rains fire down on the sacrifice of Elijah, and then they kill all the prophets of Baal, and Jezebel says, I'm going to kill you, Elijah. And he runs into hiding, and he's actually depressed and hungry and tired. And then Elisha is called to resume and take up the mantle of Elisha. And so he goes around with Elijah at that point and is kind of his understudy, and Elijah is his mentor. So Elijah has many things. We also know that he sees God in the whirlwind, right, as part of that encounter with his depressive faith struggle he's having there. So anyway, that's some stories about Elijah. Now you get to 2 Kings, which we haven't really gotten to yet, but I'm going to go ahead and we'll go to 2 Kings in a couple of weeks. We'll be off next week for the launch party, but I want you to see that the first part of 2 Kings is full of Elisha stories, right? He's taken to heaven, Elijah's taken to heaven, and then Elisha assumes his role. There's some water that is bad, and so Elisha heals that water. This next story, he is made fun of by some young men. I don't know if you remember what they were making fun of him about. I'll give you a hint. I have some, but maybe Elisha did not, and so they were calling him bold bald head. And Elisha, I guess, didn't want to deal with that, so a bunch of bears came out of the woods and mauled these young men. So I mean, you think our youth group is rough. Elijah calls out bears, and So anyway, I can't say I understand all these stories. I'm just telling you that's what happened. But and then he has a similar experience with the widow's oil jug. It continues to be replenished. Then there's a Shunammite woman who continues to house Elisha in a little room, and then her son dies. Elisha resurrects him, another prophetic resurrection. Then there's some stew that is poisoned, and Elisha takes care of making sure nobody dies from that, and he miraculously feeds the prophets that are gathered. Naaman, that's a pretty well-known story, is going to dip in the Jordan River 7 times to be healed of leprosy. Naaman is not he is not from Israel. He is a foreigner. There's an axe head that is caused to float on the water and is retrieved after it's lost. Elisha's servant has his eyes open. He sees the army on the hill, And then after Elisha's dead, this story is kind of crazy. Some people are throw a dead man's body into this tomb to hide it, and because it touches Elisha's bones, this body comes to life. There's power in Elisha's bones. And so, anyway, all of those stories are in the first part of 2 Kings. Following the death of Elijah, Elisha rises to prominence. So you go back to that, to those kings there that we're talking about. And again, Elijah and Elisha are the prominent prophets. And again, those stories are definitely worth looking at there. If you're doing the readings, you've read all this, but they're prophesying. They're dealing with the kings. They're speaking messages of change into the life of, in this case, northern Israel. Okay, we're going to talk later about the southern tribes of Judah, but again, the tribes of David that remain. But this is the north, all the way from the split and Jeroboam and the continuation of his sins throughout the generations to their exile, and the prophets are speaking into that. And so, I want you to understand that this is kind of what is going on there. So, what are some applications? It's interesting. I'm going to say this because this is the one that's kind of been coming to my mind. As our culture changes, gets further and further away from God, and again, make no mistake that the earliest Christians were, the church was founded in a culture that was against it, the pagan culture and the Hebrew worship, because they thought they were heretics to follow Jesus. So culture has been against the church and against Christians from the beginning, although periods of that have ebbed and flowed. But as our culture, American Western culture, shifts away from God and its moral underpinnings, where is the prophetic voice? Where is the prophetic voice of the church? And I certainly, it's a complicated thought in some ways, because some people are just mean people, and they wear the name of Christ, and they wear the name of church and religion, and they're just flat out, I think, mean people, and they're cloaking their anger, they're cloaking their, and this is Dave's opinion, and it's for discussion, right? They're cloaking their hatred and their bitterness and their reviling of culture under, I'm a prophet. I can speak the way I want to speak. I speak for God. Well, maybe they do, maybe they don't. I'm not saying necessarily what they're saying is inaccurate or not true, but we also know that Jesus didn't always speak with hatred in his heart. And yet, however, my point tonight is, where is the prophetic voice and nature of the church in our society? In our culture. Are we calling people back to the Word of God? Are we calling people back to know God? Are we calling people back to turn from their sin? And again, God is a loving God, a forgiving God, a merciful God. He's also a just God, and a God who we read there in 2 Kings, was that 12, 13, 14, where Israel followed the ways of Jeroboam until when? God sent them into exile with the Assyrians. And he was merciful. He later returned them to their home. Think about Nehemiah and Esther and others, and we'll talk more about the exile prophets later. But understand understand what I'm saying. Where is our prophetic voice? We need to find a balance in our message between love and grace and mercy and truth and concern and voicing when God tells us that we need to change. You know, we cannot neglect our duty. And there are some people who are going to be more prophet, and there are going to be some people who are more shepherd and more pastor and more minister. And there are going to be different voices needed at different times from different aspects of the church. But I wonder where that voice is. So as I look at that, that's one thing that comes to mind. I'm looking for the chat box. Let me see if I can find it. I'm not, here it is. Let's see if anybody's saying anything. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about that. I'm also curious what your thoughts are about how people can drift for so long, generation after generation, away from God. Leadership is important. Here you have these kings that are supposedly originally in place by God, and they make decisions that lead the people away from God. And it seems like to me the people willingly went along, and the prophets were the only ones standing up for the most part to say, no, don't do this. And so there's that aspect as well, as the way our culture can drift and take things and make them convoluted and mix them and distort and contort them, where things can seem good but also bad. They're also bad, and it's a little confusing, right? The best lies are those that have a lot of truth in them. You mix the lies and the truth. And so I don't know. You know, we look at the example of these kings, and then we think about these prophets, and we think about the people, and we think about what God ultimately had to do, and it's sobering. It is sobering. And again, I know many people are going to want to compare our situation here in America, as I did earlier, to this, and I think there's some truth to that. There's some parallels for sure, as we go down a certain road, and as our culture has tended to be more and more atheistic and immoral and godless, we are going to probably look more and more like oddballs. As Amos and Hosea and the prophets, Elijah and Elisha, who dealt with all of these folks, all of these kings and people, you wonder if that's not going to start becoming more of the norm. And so anyway, just some musings there and applications about maybe what's going on as we think about the prophets, and we think about, needing to speak truth. Needing to speak the truth, and you can do the truth in love, but we must also make sure that we are communicating the truth, that these ways are not God's ways, and so forth. So anyway, I can tell I've run way over on my time, and I want to do my best to wrap this up. So anyway, God bless you guys. I do hope that this has been helpful for understanding the role of the prophets, some of the history. We're going to take a break next Sunday night. Hope you'll come to Launch Party. If you haven't signed up, please do that as soon as possible. And so we'll do that next Sunday night, and then we'll resume in the last 2 Sundays of August. We will kind of cover some of the southern kings, and I'll give you a hint. There are some good kings in the south that you're going to be very well aware of. And then we'll talk about some of their prophets as well. And then we will wrap up with Micah one of the last prophets to the northern kingdom. And then I'm not sure what we'll do in September. We'll kind of see where the readings take us, and we'll kind of go from there. But anyway, God bless you guys. I hope you have a great evening, and we will talk to you when I see you. If not, if it's here online, I'll see you here in 2 weeks. God bless.